Hi guys, this is day 34 of the AS Economics 42-day revision challenge, and today we are doing cost of inflation. Reducing inflation is an important macroeconomic priority for all governments because when you look at the goal of stable prices, it is an important goal because when you have stable prices, you don't have cost of inflation. Why is keeping keeping stable prices an important priority? Well, there are many reasons why we want to do so, but when you look at an economy's stability, an economy's performance, inflation or low inflation is an important criteria. So, what are the cost of inflation to an economy because of what we call uh, inflation? Well, we first say that there is what we call a shoe leather cost. Shoe leather cost is basically high rates of inflation sometimes results in people to lose what we call purchasing power, and that loss of purchasing power happens because people are not keeping their money in those assets which are earning interest or those assets which are doing well in times of inflation. So if money is left idle, then there is a problem of what we call shoe leather cost, where we could have a possibility of loss of purchasing power. Now, when this loss of purchasing power happens, what will the firms do? Well, the fact that firms will now have to find financial assets which can give them high rates of interest. So, what are shoe leather costs? Shoe leather costs are the costs involved in moving money from one financial asset to another in search of high interest. So, for example, let's say if I bought bonds, or if I bought, for example, a house, and let's say the house value is not going high in times of inflation. Let's say inflation is 15%, but the house is only going up in value by 5%. I may need to sort of change my money which is kept in a house. In terms of me buying a house, I might need to buy some other asset. So buying that other asset means that I need to basically liquidate and may need to buy that asset, and that basically has what we call a shoe leather cost, or the cost of changing your money from one financial asset to another. This is also it is also applied to what we call surge costs. So when you look at firms are sort of finding lowest possible prices for, let's say, inputs, or consumers are finding low prices for inputs. They are also what we call surge costs. So what is shoe leather cost? It's the surge cost as well as cost of changing assets from one firm to another, which is causing inefficiency in an economy, because if there was no shoe leather cost, clearly we don't need to sort of worry about changing assets from one firm to another. Next up is what we call menu cost. So, what is menu cost? Well, if there is inflation, we say that restaurants, stores, hotels, all other shops have to change their menus and price lists to show increased prices, and that means that every single item's price has to be changed in order to account for inflation. This results in what we call higher cost and inefficiency for the whole economy, and we call this kind of cost to be the menu cost of inflation, because it is inefficient use of resources. Next is what we call redistribution cost. So, what is redistribution cost? Well, redistribution cost simply is the cost that happens if income is distributed away from those on fixed income or bargaining power to those who have more economic power to gain large pay, rent, and profit increases. So, what do we mean by this? So, I want to give an example here. Let's say I give a person a loan where the interest rate is, for example, 10%. But let's say inflation rate is, for example, 15%. This means from the perspective of the lender, at the end of the year, the lender, for example, will get 10% back, but the purchasing power of that 10% will be much less. In fact, if I find out the real interest rate, that would be minus 5%. What do I mean by this? Well, basically the idea goes this, that if the interest rate is rising slowly than inflation rate, the real interest rate, which controls for inflation, will be lower, causing the lender to lose out. So the lenders may lose out in this case. Similarly, let's give an example of a pensioner. Let's say if you're a pensioner, right, and let's say you are on a fixed income. If you're on fixed income and your income is $100, if there is inflation of, let's say, 15%, which is a large number, for example, that inflation rate of 15% would mean your $100 will lose 15% value. Now your $100 will have a purchasing power of, for example, 85, because of the fact that inflation has reduced its purchasing power. Similarly, a worker, let's say, if you have a worker who has a low bargaining power, let's say, unless that worker, for example, has is sort of his salary is increasing, so salary increase is, for example, 10%, but let's say inflation rate is, for example, 15%. Again, this worker has a real salary increase, or real sort of wealth increase. It's basically, let me write this, real wealth increase will be again 5%. So even this worker will lose out in this case. So what we're trying to say here is this: the idea that if the interest rates or income or even prices are not rising in line with inflation, those people will lose out, and this will redistribute income from one party to another. Normally people who have high bargaining power will basically succeed in getting better prices in inflation time. The next thing we want to discuss is basically what happens when there is inflation. There will be a lot of uncertainty and lack of investment. What is uncertainty that results from inflation? Well, we say that if inflation is high and fluctuating, then there will be a lot of uncertainty to the business community. The business community may not be able to figure out their costs or even revenue, and therefore the profits will be uncertain. So profits will be uncertain, and this uncertain means that ultimately we will have lower investment, and lower investment basically means lower economic growth. So if there is a lot of sort of inflation in an economy, you will see lower investment to happen by the business community, because there is so much uncertainty, and that translates into lower economic growth because investments will not take place. Lastly, there is an issue when it comes to inflation, which is called the balance of payment. So what happens in balance of payment basically is the idea that inflation is likely to worsen the balance of payment of a country. Why? Well, basically the idea goes this: if the price level goes up, exports become expensive, imports become cheaper, and that results in X minus M to worsen. So if a country suffers from high inflation, its exports will become less competitive because export prices are going up, and at the same time, we say this, that imports will become relatively cheaper than home produced goods, which causes X minus M to rise, and X minus M to fall, because exports are going down and imports are going up. And the impact of this basically in the economy will be that once X minus M go down, you may see AD to fall, you may also see GDP to fall, and you may also see the foreign reserves of a country to be under pressure. So these are the concerns that we have when we have what we call inflation. The cost of inflation in terms of an external economy is basically on the balance of payment. Now, there are sometimes questions about cost of inflation, which talks about internal versus external impact of inflation. So the shoe leather cost, the menu cost, and redistribution costs can be internal impact of inflation, while balance of payment and lack of investment and uncertainty could be external factors, although investment even domestically will be affected. So you can mention that in your answer. Now, the next discussion I want to have about the cost of inflation is that, is inflation always harmful? Is it always bad to have inflation? So let's talk about, is inflation, let me write this, is inflation always harmful? And the answer is not necessarily. Well, if it's a low rate of inflation, we say it's not that harmful. If the inflation level is, for example, less than 5%, we say it's not harmful. Secondly, inflation is also not harmful if it is anticipated. Anticipated inflation is always sort of preferred over unanticipated inflation. So if it's unanticipated inflation, you will see it to be harmful because people will not be able to account for it. There will be more uncertainty than anticipated inflation. And thirdly, which you need to remember, is basically the idea that if the relative rate of inflation, let me write this, relative rate of inflation in a country is lower than trading partners, then it may not be a bad sort of problem. Why? Because if, let's say, Pakistan is suffering from inflation of 8%, but let's say all of the countries in the world and all of the trading partners of ours are suffering from a higher inflation, then our competitiveness will not be affected too much, causing us to still be better off. So again, if inflation is anticipated, if it's lower than trading partners, and if it's less than 5%, we always find it to be not that problematic.